Hey guys, welcome to my first Q&A. I hope everyone's doing all right, staying healthy, staying relatively sane. This Q&A is going to be about the CDT. I'm leaving timestamps down in the description so you can hop around to different questions. First question is going to be from Vinny. He asks, approximately how many cows did you say hello to during the entire trail? You're going through a lot of ranching land on the CDT, so you're going to see a ton of cows. I'll just say that if you hike the CDT, you'll see more cows on your through hike than you have in your entire life up to that point. Andy asks, did you have any profound epiphanies, philosophical or otherwise, while on trail? I think one thing stands out to me for this. Later on during my through hike in Idaho, maybe southern Montana, I was starting to feel burnt out, both mentally and physically, just from being on trail so long. And I was focusing too much on reaching Canada and finishing the trail, and I think I lost sight of why I had started the trail to begin with. I through hike because I want to be outside all the time and live in these beautiful places, and also it's a great opportunity to learn about myself. And I was kind of missing all of that and just, trying to stick to a schedule. And I realized I needed to relax and let the rest of the through hike kind of unfold as it would without me trying to impose such a strict schedule on it. Because I think a through hike should be sort of the antithesis to the stress of our modern life and the busyness, not a continuation of it. Barbara asks, you often seem stressed out by conditions. How often did you consider quitting? I actually never considered quitting on the CDT, but that's only because it was my second through hike. So I knew that I was going to have moments where I was feeling discouraged or just low moments. And because I was kind of ready for it and I knew what I was getting myself into, I was able to deal with it better. And I didn't have any moments where I really considered quitting because I knew that I wanted to finish. When I set out on the CDT, I knew that it was important to me. Unlike the PCT was my first through hike, and I did have a couple of times on that trail where I considered quitting. Next question. Physically, what surprised you the most during your hike? I don't know if this means physically in terms of like my body or in terms of the trail. In terms of my body, I would say I was surprised and very fortunate that I didn't have any serious injuries, either overuse or otherwise, especially with all of the post-holing and stuff in Colorado. In terms of what surprised me about the trail, I would say that I was surprised at the difficulty of Colorado. Colorado ended up being more difficult than I thought it was going to be. I knew that it was going to be hard, but both in terms of the snow and in terms of the elevation change, Colorado, exceeded expectations. Sky asks, how much time do you spend hiking with or without headphones? Maybe 30 to 40% of the time. I do listen to music and podcasts on trail. I try not to do it too much because it can sort of detract from the feelings of solitude and disconnecting that we seek when we go out on trail. So I try to strike like a nice balance, because when you listen to stuff for too many hours, you kind of reach a point where you don't even know what you're listening to anymore. It's just noise. Owen asks, if you were to pick and choose the best sections of trail based on views, what would they be? This kind of goes along with another question. Candy asks, if you were to rehike a piece of the CDT in each state, where would it be? In New Mexico, the Gila River section. In Colorado, the San Juans, but with honorable mention to Collegiate West. In Wyoming, the Wind River Range. In Idaho, the Lima to Leadore section, because there's a lot of cool ridge walking. And then in Montana, Glacier National Park. Justin asks a couple of questions. How did you prioritize your time when in town between resupplying / logistics and resting? Basically, I would just try to get my resupply and other stuff done as quickly as possible so I could relax as long as possible. How did you plan how much food you had to carry for each section? I actually have a really efficient way of resupplying at grocery stores on trail. Shout out to my friend Adam that I met on the PCT in 2018 for giving me this idea. But basically, I'll go into a grocery store and I will, in the calculator on my phone, multiply the number of days that I'm going to be out by the number of calories I want to eat each day. So we'll say 3 days times 4,000 calories a day. That'll give me 12,000 calories. And then when I'm in the store, as I pick things off the shelf, I will subtract the total number of calories in that package from the total I have in my calculator until I get down to 0. And that way I know I have more or less as much food as I'll need for the next section. And then I'll get some Ziploc bags, go outside the store, and portion everything out by the day. What tasks were things you always did or thought were necessary when you got into town? Resupplying, charging my devices, and then occasionally washing myself and my clothing, although admittedly that didn't happen probably as much as it should have. Alex asks, did you carry paper maps or just use your phone to navigate? I used both. For much of the trail, the paper maps were just for a backup, but in Colorado, when a lot of the trail was snow-covered and I was using terrain to navigate, the paper maps were nice to have sort of like this big picture overview of the terrain I was moving through. And they were really user-friendly, too, because I printed them on 11 by 17. Oh no, my phone died. I knew that was going to happen. My hands are numb. This is such a fail. Phone problems. Julian asks, how was dealing with rain? Do you wish you had used an umbrella in New Mexico? Rain is an unfortunate reality on the CDT, but thankfully it's usually limited to these short but intense afternoon thunderstorms. I did have a couple of times where these storms were prolonged and lasted into the evening. A couple of times I got soaked down to my base layer and had a very just soggy, unpleasant night. But thankfully those were the minority of times. Usually, like I said, it was just these short afternoon storms, which are pretty easy to manage. As for umbrellas, I hiked with a couple of people who used umbrellas and really liked them. I was able to get by fine without one. I feel like I can protect myself well enough from the sun just with sunscreen and then a hat that has a protective neck drape. But I think it's a matter of personal preference, so I would suggest if you're curious about umbrellas to just go on a trip with one and see if you like it. J. Paul asks, do you wish you had more time to finish, or did it feel too long? I would say I think I hit a sweet spot with the amount of time it took for me to finish the CDT. I did it in 132 days, and by the time I finished, I felt like I had had a very full and immersive experience, but I wasn't super burnt out. And I felt like I could probably have gone a couple more weeks after I'd finished, so I think I did it in a good amount of time. Anna asks, in the high snowy mountains, you were making everything to hike by yourself. How did you manage the balance between hiking alone and in a group? Yeah, there was a section where I was sort of set on hiking by myself, the Collegiate West section in Colorado, but that was because in a previous section in the San Juans, I had bailed from the higher official route and taken a low elevation alternate because conditions were dangerous and I was by myself. And after that point, I had sort of felt like a failure, and then I wanted to prove to myself that I could get through a tough section alone. But after making it through Collegiate West, during which I had to deal with a big snowstorm and a pass that had a cornice on it that was sketchy, I think I pretty much satisfied that desire to prove anything to myself. And after that point, I was happy to have company. I like hiking solo for the solitude, and I also like hiking with other people. So I try to strike a balance. When I'm hiking with other people, I'll often hike solo during the day and then camp at night with those people. And that's a nice balance between hiking solo and hiking with others. Anna also asks, I'm curious about your thoughts on your shelter system. If you were to do it again, would you use the same? Oh, I'm getting cold. If you don't know, I used 2 different shelter systems on the CDT. For the southern half, I used a Yama Mountain Gear Ceriform tarp, and I paired it with a Bora Gear bivvy. This was a really nice system because I could cowboy camp in the bivvy when the weather was nice and still have some bug protection. But then when the weather turned nasty, that tarp is very protective. The biggest weakness of this system is the bug protection is pretty minimal. So when the bugs came out, especially the mosquitoes later in the summer, I switched to another shelter that I own, the Z-Pack Solplex, which is a single wall tent with all around bug netting, and that was much better for dealing with mosquitoes. If you only want to have one shelter for the CDT, I would just keep it simple and go with a single wall tent. Yvonne asks, any advice for older folks who are finally out of the rat race and for some reason are obsessed with doing the CDT? Did you meet any older thru hikers, 60 and older? Well, I can't say that I met anybody 60 or older. I'm sure some were out there. I did hike with a couple of guys who were around 50, and they didn't have any trouble. My advice for older hikers would be the same as my advice for younger hikers. If you really want to do the CDT and it means a lot to you, I would just go for it. I wouldn't let age discourage you. I would just make sure that you get plenty of training in ahead of time and maybe give yourself a slightly earlier start date so your body has plenty of time to adapt. He also asks, best places for steak along the way, not talking about the live cows you encountered. I didn't eat any steak on the CDT, and that's because I'm a vegan. At least I was a vegetarian on the CDT. I did my best. I would say since you're going through so many ranching communities, you're not going to have a hard time finding a good steak in many trail towns, particularly the northern states, I would think, although I can't comment personally on that. He also asks, which segments of the CDT need work the most in case we want to volunteer? I would say that the Bob Marshall Wilderness could always use some work. It's generally a very brushy and overgrown section, and especially in the early season for southbounders, there can be a lot of blowdowns. But honestly, I would say that anywhere on the CDT could use some work, so I would just go for whatever you can access the easiest. You could get in touch with the CDTC and see if there are any trail crews in any area that you could work with. Schwen asks, how did you stay vegan on trail? Did you find that it was harder to do so on the CDT as opposed to the PCT? It was harder on the CDT than on the PCT. It's generally not a problem for resupplies because a lot of trail food is vegan anyway, like bars, ramen, trail mix, peanut butter, stuff like that. Where it was a challenge on the CDT was finding restaurants that I could eat at. I ended up eating a lot of French fries. Kevin asks, favorite resupply, least favorite resupply? I'm going to give favorite resupply to Leadville. It's a really cool town. There are awesome mountain views right from the middle of town. It's above 10,000 feet. It has the Melanzana store, so you can be trendy and get a melly. And we stayed at a really cool hostel there that had a hot tub. So I had a good time in Leadville. I would give honorable mention to Silverthorne for having the only Chipotle on the CDT. Least favorite resupply, I'm going to go with South Pass City. That's just because it's right between the Great Basin and the Wind River Range, and it pretty much has no amenities, so it's not a good rest stop. Would you do anything different on the CDT knowing what you know now? Not really. Because this was my second thru hike, I was pretty dialed in with my gear and everything, and I was pretty happy overall with my route choices. Favorite day on trail, least favorite day on trail. My favorite day on trail was when I reached the Wyoming border. Before that point, I had been struggling through pretty much record snow in Colorado for more than a month, and reaching Wyoming was sort of symbolic of just being through the worst of it. And I knew that like past that point, I could pretty much handle whatever the trail would throw at me. So reaching Wyoming was like a triumphant moment, and that was probably my favorite day on the CDT. My least favorite day was the day that I decided to bail from the San Juans and take a lower elevation alternate. Before hitting the trail, I was pretty set on doing all of the toughest and most scenic routes, so it was hard for me to check my ego and accept that I wasn't going to be able to do the entire San Juans. Greg asks, how much did you spend for the whole thing? Around $4,000, maybe a little bit less. I didn't keep meticulous track, but that sounds about right, which is pretty average, I think. Josh asks, what would be your most highly recommended off-trail alternate? Definitely Knapsack Coal in the Wind River Range, highly recommended. And also the off-trail ridge walk from Mount Flora to James Peak in Colorado. This is a little bit south of Grand Lake, Colorado. I'll put a link to a video up here and you can check out what that looks like. It's right at the beginning of the video. Both of those alternates, very cool, very scenic, highly recommended. Now, for the last question, a few people have asked, what's next? Assuming everything has more or less returned to normal by summertime, I have a pretty ambitious route planned for the Sierras. Basically, it's going to be a link up of the South Sierra High Route, the Sierra High Route, and the Yosemite High Route to make sort of like one big super high route. It would stretch from Cottonwood Pass in the south all the way up to Sonora Pass in the north, somewhere in the ballpark of 300 miles, maybe a little bit more, with a large percentage of that being off-trail travel. Yeah, it's a pretty ambitious route, so I would have at least one partner for all of it. Right now I'm just in the early planning stages, getting maps together and stuff and seeing where the routes will converge. Yeah, but it would be an incredible route, very scenic, very adventurous, and yeah, very ambitious. So fingers crossed that it ends up panning out. And yeah, I have some other things in the works, but that's my big goal for 2020 is to complete that high route. So we'll see. Alrighty, I am out of questions. Thank you guys for sending all of these awesome questions. This was fun to do, even though I am freaking cold. If you have any more questions, leave them down in the comments and maybe we can have another one of these. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.